Japan's defense equipment exports are gathering speed as Jakarta and Tokyo enter talks to export the Japanese Asagiri-class destroyer to Indonesia. It represents the third transfer of Japanese warships behind the Mogami-class to Australia and the used Abukuma-class to the Philippines. So, is Japan building a new network of navies across the region? What will it mean for peace in the Indo-Pacific? And is this network expanding our concept of the first island chain, or one theatre, to encompass more countries who face a shared threat? Japan's new 2026 Defence White Paper is expected to name China once again as Tokyo's most serious concern. But Beijing omits its role in Japan's defence build-up watch.
日本嘴上喊着和平防卫，行动上却朝着再军事化 狂飙突进，持续大幅扩充军费，放宽杀伤性武器出口，推进部署中远程导弹，扩充进攻性军事力量，囤积大量敏感核材料，推动修改和平宪法，甚至鼓吹成为能战的国家。
Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Lai Yizong, Prospect Foundation President, Alexander Huang, Council on Strategic and Wargaming Studies Chair, and from London, Bill Hayton, Chatham House Asia Pacific Programme Associate Fellow. Alex, welcome back.
Yeah.
And Dr. Lai. And also Bill in London, welcome back to the show. Now, in April, an Indonesian fisherman found a torpedo-like device in the Lombok Strait near Bali. It measured almost 4 meters long and had the name China Shipbuilding Industry Corporation printed on it. At the time, an Indonesian spokesperson said its military would safeguard the sovereignty of Jakarta's territorial seas from, quote, unauthorized activities, including the use of underwater devices or equipment by unauthorized parties in Indonesian waters. China also makes repeated incursions into Indonesia's EEZ, as you can see here, recorded by Sea Light. And 1 year ago, Indonesia said it drove the vessels out of its waters near the Natuna Islands, which was denied by China. So going to Bill in London, how bad is the grey zone warfare that Indonesia suffers from China? And what kind of message do you think all of this, plus the discovery of that underwater device, send to Jakarta?
Well, there's a real problem for Indonesia here, which is that China's so-called 9-dash line cuts right through the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, that is legitimately belongs to Indonesia. And so there is an overlap near the Natuna Islands. And China insists on going there and asserting what it calls its rights, very vaguely worded. They have no basis in UNCLOS, in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They are a legacy of the 1930s, really, some mistaken map making that was done back then. And it's caused problems in terms of interfering with Indonesian fishing boats and also with oil and gas delivery. I think I'm less worried about these underwater drones because maritime scientific research is something that all countries do. I mean, it's specifically allowed. But the problem is that China's not transparent about what these devices are doing. The same information can be useful for, say, monitoring fish stocks, but they can also be useful for, submarines. And that's really what's going on here, a sort of hidden battle about the underwater domain.
Yeah, let's go to that. Now, the Lombok Strait, one of 4 strategic choke points that Indonesia sits astride, including the Malacca Strait, Sunda Strait, Umbai, Wetar Straits. Alex, I'm coming to you next. How geostrategically significant, therefore, does it make Indonesia?
Yeah, because these waterways are, in a sense, the gateways for shipping traveling from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean. But it's also a gatekeeper if there is a contingency or hostile situation. So Indonesia itself controls the 4 major choke points. The choke points that becoming more and more important when we learn hard lessons from the problems in the Strait of Hormuz. So I think the world, including Asian countries, are trying to find the alternative route for maritime traffic and also safeguard the security and safety of maritime traffic in those important choke points.
Right. What we're saying is that Indonesia controlling those choke points, Dr. Lai, has leverage. What do you think China was doing with that? It turns out that it was some form of underwater surveillance device.
Yeah, first of all, I think that either China was afraid of probably during the conflict, whether that's with Taiwan or whatever country they have, China is afraid of being choked out, so that they like to see the not only the Malacca Strait but also the Lombard Strait as well as Sunda Straits, because those two straits are the alternative routes, and then the Malacca Straits connecting South China Sea all the way to the Indian Oceans. Or China is actually experimenting whether if China decided to do something about the blockading the Malacca Strait, and also like to research about the alternative strait like the Sunda as well as the Lombard Strait, is a violation of the Indonesian sovereignty, but also it's a violation of the international law. And that itself has no excuses. And so China knows this, but still does those things. That means that their motive is very dubious.
Bill, does this explain why Indonesia and Japan are both seeking closer defense cooperation with each other? And we know as part of the agreement that there will be the sharing of sensitive intelligence along with the destroyer, the Japanese destroyer to Jakarta.
I think what Japan is trying to do here is to step into the gap that is being left by the American partial withdrawal from Southeast Asia. The US is no longer, stepping forward to always be the partner of choice. I'm not saying it's leaving completely, but Japan is clearly worried that the US, is or will dial down its presence, and so it's stepping up. So that's why we've seen Japan, engage in much more defense cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia in a way that would have been impossible just over 10 years ago, for example. I think it really sort of sees that it needs to bolster the autonomy of these Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam in particular, so that they have the backing to stand up for their rights when it comes to disputes with China.
And does it help, Bill, that both Japan and Indonesia, face this same shared threat from China?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Japanese perceive that what they are worried about when it comes to, say, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands is the same thing that Indonesia is worried about when it comes to the Natuna Islands and the exclusive economic zone around them and the other countries. If it wasn't for China's behavior, then this wouldn't be happening. So it's a shared sense of threat and worry about what a very large, very assertive, very untransparent country is doing around the coasts of North and Southeast Asia.
Now let's go back to the map showing Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia and Australia. Alex, what do you make of this concept that Japan perhaps is building a network of navies?
I think Japan is not only, given this strategic transformation, I think not only building up a network of navies along the first island chain, including Indonesia, but also Japan is very active in pulling everybody together in the integrated air and missile defense as well along the first island chain. So overall, I would say the network of a navy is part of a greater plan which will enable Japan to not only selling lethal systems to neighboring countries, friendly countries, but also lock them into the future logistics support, technology assistance, and other personnel training. So it's a relatively long-term security collaboration initiated by these actions.
Right. And Dr. Lai, is this Japan's answer to China's expanding or expansionism, rather than matching China, boat for boat, vessel for vessel? It's linking, as Alex explained, this network together.
I think it's more about the capacity building, especially for the Southeast Asian nations, whether that's Philippines, Indonesia, including Vietnam, altogether. All of them, they share the concern about the Chinese expansion. But I'll say that Japan's selling the Mogami-class ship to Australia. It has more to do with how Japan was able to learn from the historical mistake it had about 10 or 13 years ago, where at that time Japan was competing against French and for the selling of the submarine to Australia, and Japan lost. Due to the fact that probably Japan wasn't experienced enough and not being able to provide attractive military arms sale deal to Australia. So Australia at that time decided to go with France. Of course, later on, they also changed the plan to work with the United States for the nuclear submarines. So I would say that I was tending to separate Japan's cases selling to for the Southeast Asian arms sale and Japan's selling to the Australia as two different ones, two different categories.
Oh, right, okay. Bill, can we see Japan, I mean, Alex mentioned this briefly, can we see Japan perhaps beginning this arms diplomacy, which has traditionally been monopolized by the US, for example, exports of F-16s or F-35 fighter jets?
Well, I think there's going to be a limit on what the Japanese are willing to do. I mean, I think there are two different things here. I mean, the sale of ships to Australia is a commercial deal, whereas I think the gifting of ships to the Philippines and Indonesia is much more of a sort of aid-related consideration. But clearly, what Japan wants to do is to reinforce its own security by helping other states in the region, broadly in the wider region, to reinforce their own security. And I think it's already been mentioned, that Indonesia does not want to be dependent on any one country. That's why it sort of buys a few ships from here and a few ships from there, so that if there was ever a crisis in the future and a leader in a different country decided it didn't like Indonesia, then it wouldn't be able to kind of turn off the supply of spare parts and therefore completely kind of hobble the Navy. So that's kind of why Indonesia sort of shops around for ships from different places. But yeah, there's clearly an overall strategy towards what Japan is doing, and it's about making sure that these countries can stand up for themselves.
And Alex, you mentioned it first. Perhaps this concept of arms diplomacy, especially with Indonesia and the Philippines. What's the difference, do you think, between the US approach and the Japanese approach? I mean, is the Japanese approach about exporting resilience?
I would not categorize those because I believe the very nature that in Asia-Pacific region we have no NATO arrangement. So we have a network of bilateral security arrangement. I think with the strongest bilateral security alliance with the United States and Japan, Japan either by its own intention and also could be encouraged by the United States that try to help the Asian allies. I think the interests are parallel. Japan might have been doing assistance to the United States, and also build on the gradual awareness of Asian Pacific countries, because there is no Asian NATO. So a coalition of friendly partners and allies that learn to work together through arms transfer, diplomacy, personnel, training, exercise. I think gradually we can have a Asian type of coalition without a name, and that probably is the future trends that we need to continue to observe.
Dr. Lai, let me come to you now. And so can we say that China's aggressions are actually pushing Indonesia, which is a non-aligned country at the end of the day, closer to Japan, and which is essentially the US alliance?
Definitely Indonesia's purchasing of Japan's second-hand ships, military ships, have something to do with the Chinese very aggressive behavior. But of course, we also noticed that Indonesia sort of diversify its purchase from over the world. Indonesia also purchased French fighter jets, as well as the Soviet Union, the Russians' weaponry systems, including Chinese weaponry systems. So that if the China accused Japan for selling the military equipment to Indonesia as the expansion of militarism, how could China expand itself? Because they also sell the weapon to Indonesia as well.
So it's actually, you maintain it's more diversification, it's hedging, as opposed to moving into this camp. I mean, obviously we know that Indonesia signed the major defense cooperation partnership with the US. Part of that was that letter of intent that was very controversial, possibly giving US overflight or military access to Indonesian airspace.
That itself is more military operationally relevant rather than military equipment relevance. So that the Indonesia and the US, definitely that gave the US all kind of the convenience in terms of the military operation should that the United decided to conduct. But it tells us more about is Japan's selling rather than Indonesia's purchasing. Because for Japan, it really comes a long way for Japan to be able to really sell the military equipment, especially particularly to some other countries, not just about Philippines, which mostly is about Coast Guard, but Indonesia is the second-hand the warships. That itself expands the transformation about Japan's foreign military arms sale policy.
Okay, and Alex, you former admiral in the ROC Navy, can you explain how this Asagiri-class destroyer, in particular, how it could help Indonesia? We started off the show by talking about the critical sea lanes.
Yeah, overall, the Southeast Asian navies were small and backward. I think it is, in my view, the Japanese initiative to strengthen and embolden the naval and air capabilities, together with the United States, to help, the Southeast Asian nations from the Philippines to Indonesia. The destroyer, the particular class, will provide Indonesian Navy with much better fleet air defense, and more importantly, the shipborne anti-submarine warfare helicopters. And it helps Indonesian Navy a critical and necessary assets to detect and find out, any underwater threat and share information intelligence with the allied countries. I believe that Japan, as United States changes national security strategy, it's being a Japanese initiative to provide neighboring countries along the first island chain with better naval capability.
Now, let's hear from the Australian Defence Minister speaking about his country's cooperation with Japan Watch.
This is the third time this year that Minister Koizumi and I have met, which reflects how important our relationship is. As I've said on a number of occasions, there is no country in the world with whom we have a greater strategic alignment than Japan. And that in turn is underpinned by complete trust. And the value of that is particularly felt given the circumstances in the world today.
Contrast that with this from Beijing after Koizumi's rejection of China's so-called neo-militarism.
日方这位官员刻意回避历史的罪责，选择性忽视上述事实，反而企图倒打一耙，混淆视听。这究竟是心虚，还是企图掩盖自身军事扩张的野心？在这种情况下，日方所谓的对话也是虚伪的，只是摆姿态、装样子，没有任何诚意。
So, Dr. Lai, this Chinese Foreign Ministry comment was in response to Koizumi's speech that he delivered in Singapore. You were actually there. What do you make of, everything that's come out since then?
First of all, when the Defense Minister Koizumi delivered that speech, you could look at the audience, especially listening to the speech. Everyone was smiling and knowing that who the Defense Minister Koizumi was referring to. And also when Chinese senior colonel in the audience asked questions and demanding Japan to give the answers, I do notice a lot of the people, they shake their hands in disbelief about why China can even ask a question like those. So I would say that the Koizumi, although he did not really come out with a very strong words, but his heavy position firmed. But his positions actually got a lot of support from the audience. Many of them come from Southeast Asian countries, particularly the country that China assert that those countries, they are so fearful about Japan's new militarism.
Exactly, and the irony there is quite stark. Bringing Bill back in. Bill, I wonder if you could address some of the words, the language that we just heard the Chinese spokesperson use. You know, Japan has evaded historical crimes. It's seeking to shift blame, confuse public opinions. Does it have a guilty conscience, etc.? What do you make of this?
And I guess you could call this cognitive warfare, couldn't you? I mean, the idea is to try to delegitimize anything that Japan does now by referring back to its war crimes in the Second World War, sort of 80 years ago. So, you know, it seems like a kind of, you know, a very old-fashioned Chinese approach. I don't think it's likely to convince anybody in Southeast Asia. I mean, their experience of working with Japan, you know, in recent decades has been one of cooperation, economic aid, you know, in a Chinese language, you know, win-win cooperation. So I would be very surprised if this does anything other than make Chinese people, you know, Chinese officials feel better about themselves.
And Bill, what is it that that China is so scared about in terms of Japan normalizing? I mean, no other country is saying the things that it is saying, as was pointed out by my guest here in the studio.
Well, I guess China sees Japan, and I think probably quite rightly, as the country that's doing the most to bolster you know, resistance to China in the region. And it's really stepping forward as the United States kind of considers, you know, exactly what it's going to be doing in the next few years. So I guess it sees that if it can somehow, you know, push, you know, Japan back, then it generally, you know, it strengthens China's overall strategic situation. And obviously, Japan has been quite, you know, vocal. You know, its prime minister has been vocal very recently about, you know, maintaining the status quo in Taiwan and what a security crisis in Taiwan would mean for Japan. I mean, I think really just stating the obvious, frankly. But it's therefore sort of, I think, you know, coming under sustained attack. And I guess the idea is to try to frighten countries in Southeast Asia that somehow by choosing to cooperate with Japan going forward, that they might incur the wrath of China. So far, it just seems to be talk. There doesn't seem to be any real consequence for these countries' cooperation with Japan.
Okay, I want to get Dr. Lai's take on something that Bill said. He believed that, you know, they're in different categories. Australia, that was more of a commercial transaction, different to that of the Philippines and Indonesia. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with Bill about the Japan sale to Australia. It's more about a commercial sale. And
so it's not about, you know, security in this region. I mean, Australia also has been challenged by China, has threats, maritime threats from China.
But Australia is a country have a strength in itself, and also there's a very strong U.S.-Australian alliances and U.S.-Japan-Australian trilateral security cooperations. The deal that Japan sold to Australia is more about how Japan can provide the best in terms of cost-effective manner for the Australian their defense plan in the defense the reform. But for the Japan sale to the both Indonesia and Philippines, and also to Vietnam, it's part of their official security assistance package. So that's very different from the ordinary arms sale to the Australia, for example. And about the military equipment, Japan sell to the three Southeast Asian nations. They are more in terms of their capacity building for the maritime domain awareness or the basically maritime defense cooperations.
Okay, and Bill, just very finally, this idea of the first island chain, it seems that there are mixed understandings. You know, is Indonesia technically part of that geography of the first island chain?
Well, I think you just have to look at the map, and you kind of, if you turn the map around, upside down, if you like, from our conventional, way of looking at it, you see that the whole Chinese coast is surrounded by islands which are controlled by governments which are suspicious of China, from Japan, through Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. So yes, this first island chain is a real thing, and that's sort of coming back to where we started with these underwater drones. The battle is to a large degree about the underwater domain. I mean, China wants to use the South China Sea to hide its ballistic nuclear missiles. And of course, the US and Japan is very concerned about that. That's why there's a kind of very sort of secret underwater battle going on about who can control, the deep waters of the South China Sea in terms of sort of submarines and surveillance and all the rest of it. Because at the end of the day, that's where the part of the Chinese nuclear arsenal is going to be based. So that's really, the other much deeper layer to what's going on. And then at the same time, on the surface, you have fights about fishing rights and oil and gas development, and continuing tussles over the sovereignty of these tiny rocks and reefs. So at every level, from the kind of the local to the global, the South China Sea and the fate of the first island chain is absolutely critical.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much to my guests, Alex Huang, Lai Yizong, and Bill Hayton. Thank you for your time today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.